In this video, I want to talk about the HBS interview and some of the things that make it unique. If I have to summarize, I would say that the HBS interview is meant to be a kind of simulation of a case discussion, like what you'd see in the classroom at HBS. What I mean by that is that HBS does not want to ask you the same old questions that everyone knows and hear a bunch of answers that they know you've practiced 100 times before you got to the interview, but they want to put you on the spot a little bit, ask you a few tough questions, kind of break through your preparation and force you to speak impromptu, put you on your toes and see what you'd be like so they can predict what you might be like in the same kind of situation in the classroom. There's a few little tricks that they sometimes use, so I always advise people as soon as you get on the premises for the interview, whether that's going to be on campus or at the off-site location, sometimes a corporate office or a hotel where they're holding the kind of international interviews, you need to be on. Don't be waiting until you get to the interview table and you sit down before you feel you're ready, because sometimes the interviewer will check little things before or after that. If they retrieve you from the waiting room, they will almost certainly be taking a look. Are you having a pleasant conversation with the other people who are waiting for their interviews? You might be walking back to the interview room from the waiting room, and instead of one of these little pleasantries, nice weather, isn't it? They might hit you with a big question right off the bat as you're walking back. So, why did you leave your last job? And this isn't scary so long as you know what to expect. If you're ready for it, it's no more difficult to answer the question when you're walking back as when you're sitting down. Or if they hit you with one of those things, just one last thing before we go. So be ready as soon as you're there and don't relax until you're really done with it. In general, I say that the HBS interview is like a sport, by which I mean that you can't predict every single thing that's going to happen. So you can't approach this in terms of trying to come up with a huge list of every possible question and practice each one. What you're really trying to do is to become skilled in this kind of task of answering impromptu questions about your background and some of the related areas. Having said this, there are certain areas that are predictable that HBS likes to ask about, so I'll go through a few of those. The interviewers will have reviewed your application file in great detail before they sit down to the interview. And one of the things they like to ask a lot about is your background and especially why you made choices at certain key points. So some common questions. They may ask you about why you picked the major that you did in college. And if you didn't do that major, what else interested you or what you might have studied instead. They're very likely to ask you about the motivations for your career moves, why you took a certain job and not another job, and another thing that they do like to do is to have you do a deep dive on a given project that you listed on your resume. So tell me about that particular deal. What were you doing? And asking you a lot of little needling follow-up questions as you go. A second kind of big domain of questions that they like to ask about is questions about yourself and looking for some kind of self-knowledge and reflection. These questions are a little bit similar to ones you might see at other schools, but HBS usually likes to try to put a little twist on it so that they can get a kind of a fresh answer from you. So instead of just the plain old describe yourself, they might say, well, how would your colleagues at work describe you? Oh yeah, great. Now, how is that different from how your friends would describe you? So it's a similar question, but they will try to alter it a little way to make sure they get a fresh answer from you. They might also say, instead of what's a weakness, I've heard them ask people, well, what's an area that no matter how hard you worked, you could simply never be great at that skill or that quality? So Think about your strengths and weaknesses and be ready to answer a wide variety of different ways of asking some of these questions. Another area that they love to ask about is they love to ask about current events and industry knowledge. They're looking for people who are curious about the industry that they're in and to some degree business in general. So for many years, for example, we've seen a lot of healthcare applicants get asked about the implications of the Affordable Care Act. whatever the kind of big issue in your industry is, whether that's a kind of a merger, a new regulatory development, or some other kind of a thing, you'd better be ready to have an opinion on it, to know what's going on. Anything that someone who's a skilled professional in your industry ought to know, make sure you know it. Finally, there are a few kind of screwball questions that you simply can't predict at all. So we had one guy a few cycles ago who was a private equity investor, and of all topics, they started to interrogate him about how does the Home Depot ship all of these porcelain toilets over such a long distance without cracking them. The man had never invested in a toilet company. He never invested in Home Depot or some home improvement store. It was purely random, out of left field, and you see a lot of things online about these kinds of questions. My advice is you don't over-prepare for this one. Just don't be surprised if you get a few unusual questions. So, when we do our HBS mock interviews with you, we will have prepared a number of questions. We'll try to surprise you and make it a faithful experience to the real thing by going through that and asking you questions that we think are like the ones that you will really get.